Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you're having a wonderful day, and I hope you're all safe, studying hard. Life during the Depression, well, it was far from easy. All of Canada, from the East Coast to the West Coast, was affected. The whole world was affected. As we said before, 25% of the population, up to 30% of the population, was out of work. Now, how bad did it get? Well, the Prime Minister at the time didn't think it was going to be so bad. In fact, our Prime Minister, when the Depression hit, his name was Mackenzie King. And Mackenzie King said something really, really silly in a speech one day. He said, this thing's not that serious, and I'm not going to give 5 cents to anyone who didn't vote for me. Well, as the Depression worsened, of course it did, people blamed Mackenzie King. So he was kicked out of office. In his place came a guy called R.B. Bennett. Now, R.B. Bennett tried his best to stop the tide of this depression, but it was too much for him. And in fact, the population started blaming R.B. Bennett. They called things like newspapers that people used for blankets, Bennett blankets. People couldn't afford to put gas in their cars, so they hooked up their horses and their ox and basically used their car as a cart. They called them Bennett buggies. People started writing into R.B. Bennett. They got angry. This is a letter from a young girl, 13 years old, 14 years old, and it's dated 16th of October, 1933. Dear Sir, I'm a 13-year-old girl, and I have to go to school every day, and it's very cold, and now I don't even have a coat to put on. My parents can't afford to buy me one this winter. I have to walk to school 4.5 miles every morning and night, and I'm awfully cold every day. Would you be so kind to send me enough money so that I could get one? My name is Edwina Abbott. Please reply with $5. Can you imagine today? You writing Prime Minister Justin Trudeau asking for money for a coat? These are truly desperate times. Now, other people weren't so nice in their letters. Dear Mr. Bennett, since you have been elected, work has been impossible to get. We have decided that in a month from this date, if things are the same, we'll skin you alive the first chance we get. Not very nice. Stories abound like this, people's desperation. Remember, this depression lasted for 10 years. There's a story, one of the saddest stories I've ever heard of this depression. It was a 15-year-old girl in Saskatchewan. She walked down from her bed. Her dad lived on a farm. They all lived on a farm. She walked down from her bedroom to see her father at the kitchen table, and his head was down like this. And she said, Dad, what's wrong? He wouldn't even look at her. But her bags were packed at the front door. And she said, Dad, why are my bags packed? He had, in fact, taken money, sold his own daughter for $200 to a wealthy older man to marry him. Can you imagine the people? Now, once Bennett was blamed for the Depression, he himself lost the election. Well, guess who came back? Mackenzie King, the original 5-cent speech man. Now, what's interesting about Mackenzie King, he will become Canada's longest-serving Prime Minister. He will be there during World War II. Now, he's interesting because he's on your $50 bill. You probably haven't heard his name, but he is truly one of the most famous Canadian Prime Ministers. He was a little weird, though. It's true that he did actually have seances and talk to his dead mother. He claims to have talked to Leonardo da Vinci. He thought that he could gain insight by talking to dead people. Anyway, R.B. Bennett is out, Mackenzie King is back in, and takes 10 years to weather this storm. In the West, though, even though being on a farm, probably in Ontario, and maybe the Maritimes would be a better option because you'd have food, you could grow your own stuff, and you wouldn't starve. But in the West, things were different. Just when it couldn't get any worse, there was a drought, an immense drought. A drought that actually dried out the top layer of the topsoil, and it blew away like sand. and you had these dust storms. In America, they call it the Dust Bowl. And basically, the entire Midwest was this one cloud of dust. Now, can you imagine? I hope I don't have to use this anymore this year. But can you imagine getting up in the morning and shoveling out your walk and your front door because it's filled with sand? Yes, that's why they called it the Dirty 30s. But it wasn't just the dirt. Of all things, you have the Depression, you have this Dust Bowl situation, and strangely enough, you have this awful grasshopper infestation. It's true, they had these grasshoppers that would go in these huge clouds, and they would go from farm to farm, not only eating the crops, they would eat the laundry off the line. It's a true story, I'm not making this up. They would eat tractor seats off of tractors. And people thought, can you imagine? They must have thought, this is the end of the world. The economy was hit hard. People just weren't buying anything. And of course, on the farm, I'm going to quote a statistic to you. In 1928, 17,000 tractors were sold. By 1932, only 892 were sold. So you can see how the economy was just completely shut down, except for a few key businesses. What businesses do you think did extraordinarily well during the Great Depression? Well, number one was movies. Even though it cost them 25 cents a ticket, people still spent that because it was 2 hours away from the reality of their lives. Also, smoking. Everyone had this to keep smoking. It was a national habit. And of course, drinking. Anything to take your mind off the awful nature of the Great Depression. So one of the populations that was hit hardest was young men. You see, young men were not able to get welfare like families could. So they actually had to go to work camps. They set these work camps up all over Canada, and they were there to cut wood, but they were very isolated, and some of them hated it there. Some of them would travel around the country in open trains, and they were called bindle stiffs because the bindle is the bundle that they would have on their back, and that's all they would have. They would have beans inside that bindle and a little wrap that would surround it to sleep on. It was like a little cot or something, a little sleeping bag. But beans were high in fiber, they were high in calories, they had protein, and it was the easiest thing. You could just open the lid, put it on the fire, and cook the beans right in the tin. It was an awful life, and they went from farm to farm. If you are interested in this life, I ask you to check out one of the greatest books ever written. It's called Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. It's just a little book. It's so great. And if you don't want to read it, just check it out on YouTube. It's a great story. And it's about two men during the Great Depression who were going from the Midwest to the West. And basically they travel around together. One is called George and one is called Lenny, and it's a beautiful relationship they have. But they meet all these people, and all these people are very angry and alone because of the Depression, and they have no one. And people are very suspicious of each other, and they don't trust each other. But Lenny and George are always strong together. Anyways, it's called Of Mice and Men. Check it out. So the Canadian government actually did help its citizens. It did come up with some measures to alleviate the poverty of the Great Depression, and they called it relief, or POGI. Today we call this welfare, and it was instituted during the Great Depression. Also, new political parties that were bent on helping people in need, and one of them was called the CCF, and we know it today as the NDP. But guys, I'll tell you something, the Depression, it had an immense impact on the population. It was one of those events like World War I or World War II, that is still felt today, that its impact has changed its citizens. I know a guy who grew up during the Great Depression. Now, although he's old, you can still see some of the things he does that came out of the Great Depression. At Christmas time, of course, everyone makes coffee in the morning. The thing is, that stays, this little bit of coffee stays in the pot for the rest of the day. But at night, when you have your Christmas dinner, you make a new pot of coffee. Usually people just throw that out, but not him. What he will do is take the old coffee, he'll pour a little bit in here, a little bit in there into each person's cup, and then a new pot, so as not to waste any coffee. That is the depression. That's what it does to you. You don't waste anything. So I'm going to ask you, ladies and gentlemen, what do you think of our current recession? What do you think of our current coronavirus lockdown? Do you think that some of the things that are happening today will reverberate in the future? Do you think it'll change habits? Do you think it'll change the way people interact with others? Well, make sure you check the worksheet that you have to do. It's the last question. I want you to think about this. How much of an impact this current situation will have on our society in the future? Be well, ladies and gentlemen. Make sure you don't panic, you study hard, and be happy.